Every day that you tune into the radio or watch TV at the moment, people are talking about a global credit crunch. It sounds tasty, but it's certainly not tasty and something that is rather unpalatable. So to tell us about how it affects ASEAN and what ASEAN is doing about it, from ASEANAffairs, the Vice President of Global Marketing, Daniel Schwartz, back on the show. Thanks for joining us here on Morning Talk.
Always a pleasure to be back here after last month's show when Kun Roy, the founder, was on after his interview with the Prime Minister, talking about the global credit crunch. We've been reading about it for a long time, and everything's been in the news on what's happening in Europe, what's happening in the U.S., in terms of $700 billion bank bailout and mortgage bailout, $800 billion, very big numbers in those economies being pumped into the system. Well, what's ASEAN been doing about it? Well, this past weekend in Phuket, the ASEAN finance ministers were meeting together, and they were talking about what were they going to do about protecting the economies over here.
Because it's not so easy as just saying, oh, this is a state problem, the United States has a problem, AIG has a problem, but we're okay over here. The reality is there are flow-on effects, right?
Well, we live in a global market. I mean, if you look at where does China export all their goods to? The United States. So if the United States is having a problem, that causes a problem in China. Similarly, over here, you just look in the ASEAN countries, there's huge exports to Europe and to the U.S. And if the U.S. and Europe are having trouble, guess what? ASEAN's going to have trouble with the exporters. So the countries here have to do something to protect their currencies and protect their economies. And people live in Thailand, people live in Indonesia. They need to eat. They need business. So they're boosting their foreign exchange reserve cooperation. They had a pact earlier where they were talking about $84 billion being pledged to prop up the economies and for stimulus. Well, they just met this past weekend and committed to $120 billion. That's ASEAN plus 3. That's including Korea, Japan, and China, in addition to the 10 ASEAN nations.
Now, just to give us some perspective, ASEAN plus 3, we're talking about 2 billion people. That's like a third of the world's population. It's fairly substantial. Now, in terms of how big is ASEAN plus 3, economically, it's a powerhouse, right?
Oh, it's huge. 1/3 of the world's combined gross domestic product, $9 trillion through ASEAN plus 3. 16% of the world's gross domestic product. Combined foreign reserves, cash that they have in foreign currency, $3.6 trillion. I mean, they joke about China. I think China has something like $1.2 to $1.8 trillion of U.S. government debt that they own.
So they're like the biggest creditor.
Yeah. Well, as I said before, just using China as an example, they're huge exporters to the United States. So it's helpful for China and Asia if the U.S. market and the European markets are doing well. So then the export-driven economies over here have a place to sell their goods.
Now, in terms of this joint initiative, it's perhaps not quite as big as some of the initiatives Barack Obama is proposing over in the States, but it is a very substantial number. First time I understand that ASEAN has done this. What do you think will be the effect?
Well, I think the effect will be that there's $120 billion available between the nations, and it has to be figured out. $80 billion is coming from the plus 3 group, $40 billion from ASEAN, but that money will be available through ASEAN and ASEAN plus 3 in order to help the economies here as it's needed. They haven't figured out how they're going to spend it. It's a pledge of cooperation to create this fund so it is available.
Now, in terms of how they're going to manage it and how they're going to make this work, is that all clear at the moment, the framework in which people can draw down from the money, or a little bit up in the air?
That's not 100% figured out. Some of the various ministers that were there were quoted. For instance, the Thailand finance minister said the roadmap will focus on the promotion of local currency bond issues, facilitation for the bond demand, and legal framework and infrastructure improvements for the bond market. So it enables them to borrow money effectively. It gives the capability to borrow, which is what drives everything. You have to have access to credit.
And Finance Minister Gon here in Thailand, certainly highly educated, a very smart man with a huge amount of experience in the finance sector. What about Indonesia or some of the other countries that were there? They had comments on this?
Yeah, there are comments from Jean-Pierre Verbies, he's the ADB country director in Thailand.
Okay, so also based in Thailand?
Yes, he's there. He's this initially came out from Chiang Mai, so it's called the Chiang Mai Initiative, and he said it's important because it gives a signal to everybody in Asia and outside of Asia that if there was a big crisis, financing is available. The biggest problem in the West, and that started all this, was the lack of financing, the lack of credit. Businesses are driven by access to credit. They don't keep billions of dollars to cover payroll just sitting idly in the bank. They take short-term loans, commercial paper. They use those debt instruments to run their business.
Now, while everybody was there and in agreeing and enjoying and coming together, there were a couple of notable absentees, weren't there?
Yes, conspicuous for their absence this time was Japan's new finance minister, Karu Yosano, as well as Singapore's finance minister. Both of them were not at this meeting.
What's planned for the next issue? You have a story yet, or you can't tell us?
Well, the next issue that's going to hit the stands next week is the March issue, and after 2 down issues talking about the credit crunch and crisis and fuel subsidies, this is a positive one on bet on the bounce back in tourism. That's the March issue, plus it'll have coverage of the just concluded ASEAN summit in Thailand. And then the next issue after that, the May issue, will be on the property market and what's happening, riding out the storm in property, with an interview with the largest property company in Thailand.
Well, tough times for property, tough times for everybody here in Asia actually, but perhaps tougher times for some other parts of the world. Daniel, thanks very much for joining us on Morning Talk. Always a pleasure.
Always my pleasure. See you next month.
See you next month. There's more coming up after the break. Stay tuned.